Hi people. Just a quick word about the channel. I'm going to try after a long hiatus to get monetized again. I've checked it out and it seems that they've simplified the process a little bit, at least in terms of the self-regulation. My issue before had been that it was not so straightforward. It seems to be a little bit more simple now. There's still a few things to go through before I could confirm that, but we'll see how it goes. So anyway, if you see ads appearing on my videos, that's the reason why. I'm thinking, if I'm doing this, I may as well see if I could get any income from it. It's one way, perhaps, to help the channel grow. I'm going to do a film review here. It's been a while since I've done that. About time. Um, and the film I'm going to review is Final Destination Bloodlines. Now, I'm a big fan, along with my good friend. We're big fans of the Final Destination films. It's a series of films. I suppose it's best classed as a horror thriller genre. Six films from 2000 to the present. They've been very successful. They're much talked about. And just a brief overview of what they involve. Unlike other horror films, there's no killer with a mask. There's no Freddy Krueger. There's no Jason. There's no Mike Myers. The thing that makes the Final Destination series unique is the deaths are from accidents, from death itself, the concept of death itself. And there's a bit of a formula with the films, which is that the main protagonist usually starts off having a premonition of some sort of disaster that's about to happen. I probably should say at this point, I will be giving spoilers in this review, so if you haven't seen a Final Destination Bloodlines yet, then look away. I think the trailer's good. I personally think it gives away a little bit too much. It's a good trailer, but I think it gives away a little bit too much. So if you haven't seen the film, stop watching now because I will be doing spoilers. But I'll say this right now. I think this latest installment is possibly the strongest. It certainly got good critical acclaim. It had the best write-ups actually of all the films. I think it might be the strongest in the whole series. So what I'm going to do here is, yeah. Anyway, back to what I was explaining. So the formula of the films is you have the main protagonist has a premonition about some big accident, disaster before it happens, and then they generally observe what has happened, and then they and their friends or their family are killed off by death itself. Now, I would say if you're a sensitive person, probably don't watch the Final Destination films because they do involve graphic. I don't know if violence is the right word because it's not necessarily human violence. It's more the violence of pretty nasty accidents. If you're a sensitive person, and especially if you've been through some trauma, like you've survived a car crash or something like that, I wouldn't recommend watching one of these films because they're quite graphic. But there's an intelligence to it. It's not just gratuitous sort of gore. There is intelligent story writing to it, I believe. Um, so for me, if I'm ranking the films, and I'll get into the film I'm going to talk about in a minute, but ranking the films, I honestly think Final Destination Bloodlines it's in the conversation to be the best. Put it that way, it's in the conversation. Then for me, that would be followed by Final Destination 3. I admit I have a soft spot for Mary Elizabeth Winstead, but that's beside the point. The sunbed scene is iconic in that film. Final Destination, it started it all, and I don't necessarily agree with the premise that the original is the best, but in the case of Final Destination, I think the original is a damn good movie. Then four, I put Final Destination 2, then Final Destination 5, and for me, the weakest is the Final Destination. It was marketed in 3D and it was actually the most expensive, had the biggest budget. I do think it was the weakest of the films. On the grounds that I just felt it was, I don't know. I think the opening scene was graphic. It was. I just don't think it was taken as seriously as the other ones in a way that the thing about the Final Destinations is there's a serious edge to them. There's always a little bit of dark comedy involved because there's always some extravagant character, some obnoxious character, and I had that in Final Destination 4 or the Final Destination, but I don't know, it just missed the mark in a way that the others didn't. Final, Final Destination 5, again, fine film. But I think actually the acting in 4 and 5 were not on par with the first three. With this one, um, no disrespect to the individual actors, I just felt they were the weakest. That was my overall impression. Now, the Final Destination stars Caitlin Santa Ioana, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, as the main protagonist. But it's actually centered around her grandmother. The character is called Iris Campbell. The young version of her is played by Brett Basinger, and the older version by Gabrielle Rose. Filming took place in Vancouver. A lot of the Final Destination films are filmed in Canada, and it was directed by Zach Lipovsky and Adam Stein. So the big thing they done differently with this film was it had a period setting as the opening. All the other films have been some contemporary thing. We've had a plane crash, we've had a multi-vehicle pileup, we've had a drag car racing accident, we've had a roller coaster accident, and we've had a bridge collapse. But with this version, we had a period setting. And what happened was, young woman is going on a date with her boyfriend. He wants to give her a marriage proposal, big surprise. And to do this, to make it romantic, he decides to bring her to the Skyview, which is a very tall structure. It looks very similar to the Space Needle in Seattle or the CN Tower in Toronto. I'm sure they based it on that. And in this, basically, we know something's going to go wrong. This is Final Destination. Well, it all seems good. It's a romantic setting, a nice restaurant, wonderful views. There's a little boy that's messing around with pennies, and he's quite obnoxious and very annoying. There's some soul singers. This is set in 1968, so like I said, it's all period costumes and so on. Um, but the main girl, she has an uneasy feeling. She's pregnant. She doesn't want to tell her boyfriend, so she's already nervous about that. She has a thing about heights. And there's just a few little things adding up that she's all uneasy about. They kind of gate crash into the restaurant because they're not on the list. But she gives her boyfriend this rose and she kind of breaks it. And it just all seems a little bit, just something a little bit unsettling about this. Now, if you know the Final Destination film, the opening sequence always has a big build up. And my goodness, was this a big build up? um, Intensely suspenseful. Really, really well done. But suffice to say, there is a disaster. The kind of glass, see-through glass, I think there's a formal name for that. It gives way. A lot of people just fall to their deaths. Some of them are hanging on. Her boyfriend is holding on to this piece of glass, and it's cutting into his hands. Um, there is a piano hanging. She runs down to try and warn the others. There's a piano dangling as the others are sort of holding on to the structure. It falls down and crashes into a woman, and everyone falls to death. Someone burned. It's a horrible disaster. She is hanging on with the little boy that she saved, except her ring is jammed between this metal grid, and it slowly pushes up. Horrible, horrible, cringy scene. And she presumably falls to her death. Now, this is where it breaks with the other films. Usually, in the Final Destinations, what would happen is the main protagonist would then wake up from their premonition and try and warn the others. What happens instead is we go to look at the present day to her granddaughter, like I say, played by Caitlin Santa Ioana, Stephanie Campbell, and she is getting these recurring nightmares of the disaster. But the family has sort of collectively shunned this grandmother. They see her as crazy. They see her as just a destructive personality, and they warn her. They warn their granddaughter, the granddaughter, to stay away from them. She's also treated as a little bit of an outcast in the family. Not an outcast, but she's been somewhat estranged from them. She's been detached from them. So her younger brother's a bit cold with her for that reason. Her father's pleased to see her, but they're all just a bit surprised to see her. But she's went to try and get answers. They're all reluctant to talk about this grandmother. Her uncle says that the grandmother drove the family apart. He's presumably divorced from his wife. Not sorry, not the uncle, the father. Just a bit of observation. I think the intention is our main protagonist is mixed race. I don't know what her background is, but her father's Asian and her mother's white, so it's not really relevant to the story, but just an observation. Um, anyway, we know what Final Destination, what happens there. So we see there's a barbecue. Um, well, actually, no, that's not the opening scene. She goes to her grandmother despite the advice not to. The grandmother is living as a recluse, totally different appearance from the young woman she was in 1968. She's living in the backwoods, literally out in a forest area, surrounded by a heavily fortified lodge or huts, and spent her life sort of building up research on every single extended member of her family and how she can prevent their deaths. And like I say, everyone treats her as insane. But she recounts that she did, in fact, warn the others in 1968 and she actually saved everyone. So she was a hero. But instead of sort of having a life of reward, she's treated like she is a recluse and she's become quite a damaged person. There's some parallels here, I think, with the character of Claire Rivers in the second film a little bit. Um, and throughout the film, we see, I knew there'd be some nods to the other films. Perhaps the second film more than any, there's just little nods throughout this version to the second film. Anyway, the grandmother warns her, and she said, our main character is reluctant to believe her. She says, I should never have come. The grandmother says, okay, well, I'm going to, seeing is believing. And she sort of steps out of her house, and one of the apparatus tied to her house come through, bolts right through her jaw. It's pretty gruesome, but at least it's quick. If you know Final Destination, you'll know what I'm talking about. Some characters are not so lucky. The next death comes at the family barbecue, and there's, what Final Destination does with genius measure is suspense. It really is very effective with that. So a lot of things, lots of little signs. There's a shard of broken glass in ice cubes. The mother who had been estranged and comes back, she brings peanut butter, forgetting that her son's allergic. There's just all these little things adding up. There's a trampoline that's giving way. So anyway, one of the sons throws that, falls through that. The father steps on a shard of glass. He stumbles over the lawnmower, which had been released because of a pressure mechanism from, actually the rake had fallen on it, the rake that the mother had taken away, and yeah, well, it's a pretty nasty end. He gets the lawnmower in his face. Um, with the Final Destinations, I would say there's a degree of artistic license, but some of the accidents you do wonder would they really happen that way in the way that's shown. For example, in Final Destination 3, the famous sunbed scene, um, apparently my friends use sunbeds. He says there's a safety mechanism in place to show that they don't get to a certain temperature. So there is some artistic license, but you allow that for the type of film it is. Next, we see the obnoxious cousin. I'm going to call him Mr. Piercings because I don't remember his name. And he's just flat out disbelieving. He will not believe in any of this, and he's being quite obnoxious. There's usually one in each of the films. Anyway, he works in a piercing tattoo place, and again, there's a sequence of events that you think, okay, he's got it. He's hung up by the nose on the fan. You think this is going to be pretty bad. No, he survives. So that kind of takes you a little bit off guard. So that's a misstep. Um, and then we find that his sister, she ends up as the next victim because kind of an innocent looking suburban scene. There's some kids playing football. There's a garbage vehicle coming down. Well, that that was the one that really got me cringing. It was nasty. And if you haven't seen the film, look away. If you've seen the film, you'll know what I'm talking about. His sister ends up actually following what would be the sequence of events that lead to her death because the others had dismissed it. They said, look, nothing's happening. And there was a clever little nod to the, again, well, in this case, the first film where you see a vehicle go past really fast. That's a nod to Terry Cheney in the first film. Anyway, the sister ends up in the garbage vehicle, horribly crushed, and it is not a slow death. Excuse me, it is a slow death. That's the one I found hardest, I think. Um, Meanwhile, our main protagonist is obviously trying to work out how do we prevent this. They go to hospital. There we meet Tony Todd, the late Tony Todd, who's the only actor who's been in all the films. He passed away last year, and I have to say he looked quite gaunt in this. Um, he looked like a man that was seeing his last months, and shows what professional he was, because his monologue actually involved talking about death, and he must have known he was. I don't know what his cause of death was, but he must have known that. And he actually had a longer monologue than in any of the other films. It turns out his significance is he is a little boy that Iris Campbell saves in the beginning of the film. So that's its significance, and it makes a lot of sense as to his presence in the other films because it's always left a bit obscure. Now it's finally explained what his significance is. Um, so that's important. Now, I mentioned the obnoxious cousin, him and his sensitive brother. He's convinced that by killing his brother and bringing him back to life, i.e., flatlining, they'll somehow cheat death. Convinces his brother to eat some peanuts or a peanut snack, and let's just say he ends up being sucked into the mechanism of the. I'm not sure what the formal name is, but the flatlining machine. I'll call it that because he's got all these piercings. That was pretty horrendous. He's literally broken in two and sucked into it. Horrendous, but I suspect a bit of artistic license again. That's why, as much as it was cringy, it was. I wondered about that one, and his younger brother dies anyway because part of the coil on the kiosk machine flies out with this magnetic field being sucked into the machine and goes straight into his head. Um, then the few remaining characters left. So we have the mother and the two siblings, our main protagonist and her younger brother. They go to this lodge where their grandmother was, and they think if they could get their mother into the lodge, they somehow will cheat death because of the sequence of deaths. She'd mentioned something about, I'll need to watch the film again to get this exactly, but I think she'd had an affair or something, and that meant that the sequence of deaths were not as they were meant to be. Well, she dies anyway. There's an accident, the house explodes, and then structure falls on her. It's not the most shocking death in the film, but I guess for pace's sake. Our main character, Stephanie, almost drowns. Her brother saves her. Um, and this is where there is a misconception. He believes he's brought her back to life, and they think, okay, everything's great. The end of the film, um, there's an old lady who was at the hospital, and she goes to a lemonade stand. She's given this penny. The penny's significant. It's the same penny that we see at the start of the film that the little boy is messing around with. The penny drops off the table, rolls down onto a railway track. There's a big derailment, big disaster. The train plows into the street, and presumably lots of people die, including our main protagonist and her brother. And thinking about it, the only characters who actually survive in the film are the father and an aunt who nothing happens to them. Oh, and the little tortoise who had an appearance. Um, no, all in all, like I say, I think the suspense in this one was very strong. I think the opening sequence was really well done. Um, suspense wise, it was incredible. The period design was good. It felt like the 60s. Um, my friend said it reminded him of Ghost Ship, and I know what he was talking about. If I've anything, I would say that maybe I would have done a bit differently. Like I say, Iris Campbell, the young woman at the start of the film, the point is she saves everyone from the disaster. Unlike the other films, the disaster never actually happens. What happened was it closed a while afterwards for safety concerns. Now, I'm not sure about that. I think maybe it would have been a bit creepier, a bit more atmospheric if the disaster actually had happened. And I was thinking, okay, they'll go to the modern day and so her finger will be scarred from where her ring ripped off or something like that. I understand why they done that, so the story would make sense. The fact that she, saved everyone, but I don't know, because at the end of the film you see a period car go past, and you see the railway line as it was at the start of the film, and yet the track line was kind of disjointed because of the little penny that got stuck in it. I thought what they were going to do was go back to 1968 and show that actually the disaster happened all after all. And I wonder would that have been more effective than what they went with our two main protagonists being killed off and how they were killed off. Giant logs, kind of the train collapsed into a truck with some logs on it, which is a nod to Final Destination 2. It was okay. I'm not sure it was the best ending it could have been. If this is going to be the last film in the Final Destination series, bearing in mind there's Tony Todd has passed away, um, I'm not sure it was the best ending. But as a beginning, as an opening sequence, my goodness, that was something else. The deaths in this film were genuinely quite. I mean, there's not much I cannot watch, but particularly the garbage truck scene, I was literally, damn, that's hard to watch. Um, so yeah, that's it. I would probably give Final Destination Bloodlines the highest score of the six films. Although I did like Final Destination, I think that Devon Sawa was great at that role. I liked the whole atmosphere of the first film, the setup of it, and remember at the time it was a new concept, so it was exciting. Final Destination 3, yes, I have a soft spot for Mary Elizabeth Winstead, but it also had some of the most memorable deaths, so to speak. None of the films are bad, even the Final Destination, which is the weakest in the series, it had its moments. I just feel like, for example, in the opening sequence of that film, you had the kind of joking about it. Oh well, of course people die. It felt a bit flat to me. Like why ruin the scene with that joke? Or I also thought he didn't seem like he would be natural friends with the main protagonist, played by Bobby Campbell. For me, the Final Destination was the weakest. Still better than a lot of horror films out there. So yeah, I'll round this up. If you haven't seen Final Destination Bloodlines, well, yeah, I've ruined it for you. But if you have seen it, let me know if you concur with my thoughts. What else can I say? If you haven't seen any of the films, I would say be cautious. If you're a sensitive person, if you're scared of, flying or any form of transport, you've maybe been a survivor of some traumatic incident like a car crash or a house fire or something, maybe, be cautious watching it because it is quite graphic. Um, if Final Destination has taught a generation anything, it's hopefully to be more careful. I'm not sure that that has worked, but I would say that the Final Destination series has, for millennials, it's really been, quite something. Perhaps the same impact in the 2000s as Scream had in the 90s. That's how I would, I mean, I think the Final Destination films are very effective at what they do. Where do they go from here? I'd love them to make a new film, but I'm not sure how they can. I'm not really sure where they can go with this, but I hope they do. My friend had been saying this for years, and I was skeptical. I would say, "No, Christian, how can they circulate this around?" But they have, and they've done a very good job of it. So it deserves all the good reviews it's getting. And like I say, for me, just the ending maybe could have been a little bit better. I felt that was a little bit. I don't know. I don't know what they could have done. I suppose if they went back to 1968, it would make the entire franchise meaningless. So I suppose that's why they didn't. But I thought they were going to. Anyway, I think, well, I'll just finish with this. I think maybe the way they could have made it better was it showed that the younger brother was going to prom. Now, rather than having kind of a quick ending sequence, they could have had a whole setup with the prom with things going wrong. Maybe that would have worked. I don't know. Um, you can imagine any number of scenarios. In the real world, there's been many disasters at wedding parties, those sort of nightclubs, that sort of thing. Earlier this year, there was a big disaster in the Dominican Republic, in Santo Domingo. It all happened for real. Um, don't have nightmares, but check out Final Destination Bloodlines. And what else can I say? Cherish life. If these films teach anything, it's cherish life.